Oriole Cullen, thank you for being here and showing us all these amazing, amazing bonnets. Firstly, we're at the Victoria and Albert's amazing Clothworkers Centre. Tell me a little bit about the Clothworkers and what it does.
Well, the Clothworkers Centre opened in October last year, 2013.
Yeah.
And it's brought together all of the V&A's textile and dress collections from both the textiles and dress section, but also our Asia collections too. So
Amazing.
It's fantastic. We have them all here on site. The great thing about the centre is we also have a big study area,
Yeah.
so it's available for people to come and book in. It's all on our website, so you can look up and literally request to see, anything of particular interest, an area of research, and we have a fantastic team here who can accommodate that. So it's very popular. So there's a little bit of a wait, but it's absolutely worth a visit.
Yeah, it's amazing, and you get to see amazing, amazing things like these beautiful bonnets, which obviously we're talking about because Nick Knight and Amanda Harlick have done this beautiful shoot all to do with the bonnet, and they've got some amazing contemporary designers, modern designers, Riccardo Tisci, Sarah Burton, JW Anderson, to name a few, to sort of reinterpret the bonnet. But what I thought would be so interesting is to dive into the V&A's amazing collection and talk about the history of bonnets and all the different sort of social and political things that they can tell us about the time. But you're a particular sort of bonnet obsessive, aren't you?
No,
you're like,
I'm not.
But where did the interest come from? Because it's a very specific thing to know a lot about.
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of different things here in the collections.
Yeah.
And often we find when we work on particular projects that, you go into sort of researching these specific areas. And a few years ago, I worked with Stephen Jones on an exhibition about millinery and hats. And we spent lots of long hours in the stores here looking at the hats. So really, that's where I'm coming from. So
the interest comes from.
which is fantastic. And very interesting working with a contemporary practitioner, which feeds in nicely, of course, to this project with
Absolutely.
Amanda Harlick and Nick. And seeing how these shapes sort of reinterpreted and how they appear in hats today.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You think millinery more than perhaps any other form of design, it still feels incredibly historical, because the hat feels like quite a historical thing as an item. Not everyone wears a hat anymore. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think the processes have hardly changed at all. Although the materials today, people are using some incredible materials. The hedonism exhibition at London Fashion Week is always very interesting, and people using acrylics and different sort of methods of using that. But actually, basic hat structures and the way that a lot of milliners work today haven't changed in hundreds of years.
It's amazing. So tell me, which is the oldest hat that we've got here? Which should we start with? Give me a little history of what's going on.
We're looking specifically at the 19th century here, because the 19th century is really the great century of the bonnet. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I'm looking at an earlier style to start with here, which is a calash. Now this is a 19th century version, early 19th century version, but the calash actually came about in the 18th century. And the idea was it's a type of hood that you wear if you have big high hairstyles, and of course in the 18th century powdered hairstyles, wigs, quite dramatic, and so these hats developed to wear over these hairstyles. And you can see it's almost like a sort of hinged hood. It has these hooped structures across the top. They're cane, and sometimes they might be whalebone, but this particular hat, they're cane. Green was a popular colour. Sometimes you get them in black, but as you can see, they were sort of to keep your head and your hair in place when you ventured outside. And this has got some very nice decorative gauze bows on the side. We do have, I should say, there's museum stuffing inside these to support them. So, but it's a sort of working environment. So I hope that's okay.
It's so interesting. We were saying before, but I love this idea. I think most of our viewers would perhaps presume that change in shapes and styles in hats purely came from sort of millinery trends, and that it was the hat itself that was the kind of the fashion leader there. But it's interesting you talk about the way that hats responded to changes in hair fashions or even just in clothing fashions, and we're seeing that here, aren't we, with that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a full silhouette really, and from the mid 18th century there is a big interest in hair and hairstyles, and I'm sure we've all seen caricatures of women with ships in their hair and things. So,
bird cages.
Exactly, So, I mean, hair is a really important factor in the 18th century. And yes, headgear responds to that. but also, as we'll see, just the general overall silhouette. You know, there is a synergy between that. They're not something that develops completely,
separate,
you know, on an independent.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, just tell me a little bit more about this notion of the 19th century as kind of the age of the bonnet. Why is that?
Well, I think it just becomes a very popular form of headwear in the 19th century.
Yeah.
So 18th century, we've talked about large hairstyles and things. By the close of the 18th century, there's been a dramatic change, of course, French Revolution. By 1792, fashion has really changed. Paris, of course, being the leader in fashion and political upheaval, obviously, having an effect on that. A very pared down silhouette comes in, looking at sort of neoclassical periods, so looking at classical sculptures and the natural body, and there's a real emphasis on that.
Sure.
So the head becomes a much more natural look rather than big hairstyles and wigs.
Sure.
It's about closely cropped hair. And as a result, very small little hats come in that sort of focus on the head.
Which is quite like the J.W. Anderson one that he made, isn't it, for the shoot, you know, quite modest.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and it's sort of enclosing the head and having a more natural proportion. And so I think we'll probably see one of these straw bonnets. I think we're going to
a bit later.
Those, yeah. But because of that, this focus is on the face, and there is a lot of playing around with that. And as we'll see, the bonnet sort of begins to develop, and you get something called a poke bonnet.
Yeah.
I'm just going to look here. This is a sort of later version of the poke bonnet. You can see it's quite close. It's quite small on the crown here, but quite long towards the front. And that's interesting because, of course, when you look straight into the bonnet, you're really focusing on someone's face. You know, obviously we have a bit of a support here. Sadly, we don't really get the full effect.
And is that to do with ideas of kind of modesty as well, of this idea, as much as it is focusing onto the face of the wearer? Is it also about shielding the wearer from sort of the viewer and those around them?
There are various different, I suppose, as with today, various different reasons and ways of wearing these hats, and absolutely, I mean, protection is one of them. To protect from the elements. At this time, it was really, people didn't want to expose their skin to the sun, and they wanted to protect from that. So bonnets, you know, with these long brims on them, did that. But of course, fashion comes into it. So the proportion of how long you went with your
it becomes more of a statement. That's
and then also modesty is something that I think we'll come into. And you know, when Queen Victoria comes to the throne in 1837, she is a very young queen, but she's very sort of modest, and the ideas of Victorian values that we associate with that era, the family, she sort of embodies that. And as we'll see with some of the later bonnets, the 1840s, you know, is a very interesting period because headwear doesn't really change that much stylistically, which is unusual. But before we get there,
yes, I'm jumping ahead.
We have sort of coming into the teens, the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century. When they end in 1814, Paris is sort of reconnected, or the rest of Europe and the world is reconnected to Paris, and there is a sort of explosion of fashion and headwear, and that 15 years from about 1814 up to 16 years up to 1830, and maybe a bit beyond, is just a sort of incredible time for headwear and bonnets, because things get incredibly exuberant over the top. Really amazing.
It's quite a good example.
Yes, and here's.
I just think it looks so modern. If you said this was made from, you know, that Prada 1996, the wallpaper fabric, you'd be like, oh yeah, I believe you.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful because obviously things fade over time, but this has managed to sort of hold some of that splendour of the colour. The yellow satin banding is really strong still. So this hat would have been worn, it's on a board here, but you can get some idea of the angle it would have been worn at. So quite, you know, the face would have had this very wide brim around the top. But also it's not just the front view, it is of course the back, which is...
Tell me about these ribbons, because they're curled up here for conservation, but what is the... Would they tie around the chin or
They would have tied around the chin, and you would have had a big bow under your chin. And they're really lovely, sort of graduated colours. But at the back of the hat, you have these incredibly structured bows, and they have a support. They have sort of little supports inside them to keep them rigid like that. And so you can imagine, you know, it's a sort of all over 360 effect.
Yeah. And what did women win points for? Was it size? Was it colour? Was it how firm and big the bow was? Or was it all three?
I think, you know, actually the interesting thing about this period is there's so many different styles of hats.
Sure.
And, you know, the thing is, it's just sort of, they are statement pieces in high fashion.
Yeah.
In a lot of fashion journals and magazines at the time, you get whole pages devoted to hats and headwear. And, you know, they're very disparate styles. This is another one dating from that period.
It's the street style bonnet, isn't it?
Exactly, and you can really see it's completely over the top. I mean, it's so impractical to try and wear that, you know, because you couldn't really see where you were going.
Yeah.
You also have this...
Imagine you'd knock into people a lot as well.
Absolutely, yeah. But it is wonderful because it's such an expression of fashion. You know, it's really sort of full on, that somebody who is not afraid to be seen and, you know, to be experimenting. And the wonderful thing is that it survives in such good condition, because the structure is still there. And it's quite, you know, there's a lot of design that's gone into it in order to sort of support this brim. There's these sort of corded supports that go through the section but have a lovely line to them that curves over. And then, you know, you get this other vertical line of the ruche fabric going up through it. And then these incredible ruffles all along the front. So it is, you know, there's a little bit of engineering.
And how long would it take a milliner to produce something like this at the time? Would these have been very expensive examples of fashionable hats? I
mean, yeah, you know, there's a lot of work in them, and they would have been worn by very fashionable women. Okay. So, you know, they're sort of women in an urban setting, most probably, who, you know, are sort of interested in high fashion. And so it really depends that, you know, working out the structure of this would have taken some time. As we see with other hats, there is a kind of straw base sometimes with them, but actually with that is sort of made with silk fabric and has a very delicate construction. A lot of the time straw hoods were produced, particularly Italy and Switzerland were very important places for straw, and they would be produced in large quantities and sold on. So sometimes people could buy a straw hood, as they were known,
and sort of make their own.
Yeah, and decorate it themselves. And also that's a very seasonal thing, that you redecorate your hat.
Yeah.
Straw tends to be a summer fibre fabric, that the material that's used. But it is also something that can be used in winter.
So a hat of this kind that you've got now at the V&A, would you imagine that this perhaps had once been in a completely different state? Because I love this one, because we were talking before, it does kind of show signs of repair. You showed me the darning on the inside, but could it be the case that this had once had a completely different ribbon on it? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the nice thing about this is we can see that the ribbon is kind of from a similar period as the hat. It is slightly degrading. You can see it's quite fine, and it's of an age. But it is possible that it had a completely different coloured ribbon on it, that it had a different way of being sort of decorated at the time. So that's a nice thing about hats, that they are something that during their own lifetime they get reinvented and have different lives. The other thing is sometimes they're lined inside, and I think we can have a look at this feather one next.
What's this one here? Is this later?
This is
I
very
love it
sweet,
because it does.
So this is, again, this is a sort of 1820s, this one.
Beautiful.
And I think it's, you know, it's, again, you know, quite something. It's really, there's a lot of thought has gone into it. The structure, because of the age, the structure is a bit soft here on the brim. So, but again, it's a sort of moire silk, and it really, you know, you really focus in on the face when you see that the brim, because it's quite tight to the head. And that's another thing with fashions and brims. You know, the length of them changes, but also the width of them. You know, sometimes they're more vertical, sometimes they become quite horizontal, and I think we'll see that with another one. Moving on. I
know, I love this feather one, because we were saying Sarah Burton, the Alexander McQueen beautiful bonnet that we shot is completely made from feathers, and it's interesting because I I guess quite naively, I presume that feathers would just be used kind of in a very minor way as a decoration. And then you showed me this example where it's really the case that feathers could encompass almost the whole bonnet.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's interesting that the idea with millinery is that traditionally you get silk flowers in some hats, but they're for summer hats.
Yeah.
Because of course you hope that the weather is better then. But the wonderful thing about feathers is that they are waterproof.
Yeah.
And so they can withstand winter weather. So often feathers are used as a winter decoration.
Winter hat.
This has got some very dramatically
I love this one.
coloured ostrich feathers on it. You can also see it's lined inside the brim, which is quite nice. It's got a pale silk, and that of course modulates the light that it throws onto your face. And it also has this incredible woven ribbon, which it would have been more purple and mauve in the stem, but it's faded, so it would have sort of
really matched.
Yeah, and it would have been tied under the chin.
And when is this one from?
And so this is 1830s.
Sure.
It's the structure of it is when you get very sort of wide brims, and then the sort of decorative ribbon, which is quite lovely.
And is this a case with this one that you'd imagine that this had taken on a different guise maybe in the summer?
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly, you know, that was completely differently decorated. I should say that the straw is actually made from straw plait. So they're little thin bands of straw that are produced, and then they're very intricately stitched together. And I mean, that's very beautiful because perhaps on this one you can sort of see the stitching, the little bands that are all stitches, sort of ridges that come through, very finely stitched. But on this one with the feathers, it's almost impossible to sort of see the joins.
Yeah, absolutely.
Between
so would this have been another hat that was worn by a more fashionable woman perhaps than the one here?
I mean, it is hard to say exactly. You know, I suppose we can speculate and say but you know, it depends. I mean, this is a slightly earlier hat than this one. So yeah, it's sort of difficult to say. Yeah. I should also note, I think we'll come on to it in a minute, the little curtain backs on a lot of the bonnets, and they're called bavellets. And the idea was that they would...
we're seeing here?
Yeah, so they would protect the back of the neck from any sunlight or, you know, weathering. So
it's interesting because a lot of the things that we're discussing, it really does sort of imply that the wearing of bonnets was to do with this idea of women being fragile and very modest and, you know, very good. But you were telling me before that there was also these quite seedy connotations that came with millinery and hat making, especially with telling me more about Burlington Arcade, because that was fascinating.
I mean, there were a lot of millinery shops in Burlington Arcade in the early 19th century. And that is sort of a promenade, and it has these big glass windows into tiny little shops. The area where it's based was around places such as Albany, which was a bachelor's living quarters, also lots of gentlemen's clubs. So that area was very much a male environment. And the milliners would be visible sitting in the window working, and you know, there were suggestions that actually it wasn't the hats that were for sale, but it was the girls that were for sale, and that the men could go and you know, promenade in this sort of shopping area, but actually looking at the girls. And this is because millinery was a very poorly paid job. Yeah. It was seasonal as well, so a lot of milliners would work very, very intense hours over the season, and then they would find themselves out of work and down on their luck, and sometimes, you know, they did turn to prostitution. So it's quite sad because there is that sort of background, and I suppose, you know, we can absolutely understand it today, as we know, you know, we all know the problems inherent with supply chains in fashion, and it's interesting to see, you know, that still we have that today.
And I guess if there was this notion as well that women could sort of make their bonnets at home as well, as this real kind of thirst for the new, it's quite an early example of that, isn't it? This idea of taking a bonnet and furiously customizing it each season to try and stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
that idea.
And I think a lot of women did do that, and I think there's lots of you know, Elizabeth Gaskell Cranford, there's lots of mentions of millinery and bonnets in that. And
Jane Austen's such an obvious one.
Yeah, you know, so there are, you know, it was definitely part of women's lives, and that sort of, it's an instant hit really, a hat, because you can see it straight away, and you can retrim a hat on not a lot of money. You know, it depends if you find bits and bobs and
Bits and
ribbons,
bobs,
and so there is a kind of joy, and it is a sort of, people I think invested a lot in their hats. You know.
Can we talk about the normcore bonnet, which is my favourite, because I love it. It's like two different angles of modern fashion. There you've got street style, then you've got normcore. But you were telling me it's such an interesting story with this one. I love the idea of the tie not being a ribbon. Just tell me about it.
I mean, so this is a Quaker bonnet. And the Quakers, you know, were very interested in the idea of modesty, and the fact that they weren't following fashion.
Sure.
But obviously at various points, you know, dress does sort of have a nod to fashion. So in the early 19th century, this is the form of the Quaker bonnet, and that lasts really throughout the century. It's very modest. You find them in blacks and grey silk. So, you know, they're made from a smart fabric, but, you know, they're not shouting.
Absolutely,
they're very low-key. They're made from a card construction. So it's quite a cheap fabric, you know. And then at the back, instead of a ribbon, there is this little cord, a little black cord. And often you find that it is the cord that really, you know...
It's trying to make the point,
yeah,
isn't it?
that, you know, this isn't frivolous, it's not decorative. It has a purpose, because it pulls in, you know, the back of the hat tight to the head. But yeah, it's sort of saying I'm not engaging with fashion. And, you know, the Quakers had, you know, they were really people like Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer, who played, you know, really important roles in society. And I think that there is that notion that they wanted to be taken seriously. You know, they weren't taken up with maybe the sort of preoccupations that this lady perhaps had.
And was fashion a real sort of, quite a signifier in that? Could you wear a hat, you know, in the same way that we would look at a woman today if she was wearing something quite revealing and presume that she was quite, you know, of a certain character? Was that very much the same with headwear? Would you look at someone and say she was a frivolous woman? Could there be a slutty bonnet, for example?
I mean, I think at every point there are sort of codes and messages within dress that you know, people, sort of contemporaries, can read, and that potentially get lost over time. But I think absolutely, I think that idea of loud fashion, you know, it sort of says it all in a way, that you're not hiding away and that you are sort of making a big statement. So I think, absolutely, there would be sort of elements to all of these hats that someone who sort of knew them at the time and was wearing them and was sort of part of that society would know.
That's interesting.
This is a sort of, I would say, perhaps a typical Victorian bonnet in a way, because it's from the 1840s, and it's that period that we were sort of talking about that didn't really change that much in fashion and style. So this sort of rather long brim to the hat, and it's quite a modest bonnet. And there is something about shielding the face, and it's sort of, again, not really shouting fashion. But this structure, whether in straw or in silk or in felt, really remains very popular throughout the 40s, and then into the 50s, things start to change. Sometimes, if you can imagine that tied very closely together under the chin, you get a sort of oval effect around the face, and that's something that is popular at that point.
We've talked quite a lot about different sort of historical ages, but was there also an element to women wearing different bonnets depending on their sort of marital status or their age or their social position? Absolutely,
At various different points there are lots of different types of hats and caps that people wear. So for instance, a lot of women in the 18th century and into the early 19th century would wear little white cotton caps under their hats, or, you know, just at home. Married women usually cover their heads. So, and, you know, it's practical too, because people didn't really wash their hair as much.
So disgusting.
You could wash these cotton caps, but you couldn't really wash the inside of your hat.
So most of these would have been worn with a little cap.
Yeah, with a little cap inside, and you sometimes get ruffles and lace. Moving later into the century, the lace and the ruffles start becoming attached to the hat itself. Because hairstyles get quite dramatic, and there's a nice example here of a hat from the 1860s. Oh, sorry,
Sorry.
around that. So this is interesting because you can see all of those ruffles.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Are inside the hat.
Amazing.
Quite over the top. And then you can see this wonderful fabric, ears of corn that decorated.
And why was there this focus on making things look like nature, like with the flowers and the corn? It's very literal. It's quite different to a flower, which is more expected, I think. You know, the corn, it's quite odd as an emblem.
I think actually because there's a link to straw, and you know, it's something that does come up quite a lot. And these sort of, you do get leaves, you do get sort of plants. So there is a kind of, I suppose we think of flowers today, but actually you do get some strange.
Like the mushroom that we've got, which we'll look at later.
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing, really going back to the feathers, is that sort of as the 19th century moves on, birds become a real focus, and feathers are something that there is, you know, there's a huge market in. And there are thousands and thousands of birds, particularly birds of paradise, that start to be imported from South America.
Oh, okay.
Feather specialists in Paris, such as Lou, you know, they work on these incredible creations. But there begins to be a real concern, and a lot of bird lovers are, you know, very worried about that because there is a drop in populations. And the Audubon Society is set up in America, and there's a lot of people writing against women and using, you know, birds in their hats in fashion. And, you know, sometimes you get full stuffed birds on the hats. Other times you'll get composite birds, so you'll get a head of one and a wing of another.
Yeah, there's one in the morning exhibition at the Met. At the moment there's a hat with a full black bird on it, which is quite horrible to look at, but you imagine very fashionable at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, it does, you know, it comes to really by the early 20th century, that's when things really come to a head. It's sorry, that the, you know, we have a full hat that's made from a full peacock.
Oh, wow.
Stuffed and it, you know, worn with a matching muffler. So, you know, there's a lot of dead animal there.
Yeah,
but you know, the feathers are incredibly beautiful. They're waterproof. There is this iridescent quality to a lot of them. So that's why they're popular. But you know, it's sort of all out kind of mass murder on the
wow, that's
large
very
scale.
interesting.
So I think there is a concern there. There is a conservation concern early on, and I think that's a nice example of kind of people sort of questioning where their
clothes are coming from. Sustainable fashion. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in Britain again is sort of very vocal on that too. The other poor animals that are used in making hats, felt hats, and traditionally they were made with beaver, but beaver populations died out actually as a result of the hatting industry in the 17th century. So rabbit fur was used, and that is.
And is that what we're seeing here?
Yeah. So this is an example, and probably familiar to people from a traditional top hat. The crown of this bonnet is very like, and that would be felted, so that the fur sort of pressed together, and it's sort of immersed in various different solutions, and then it can be blocked onto a particular form. So something like this, and then it becomes this kind of stiffened hat.
In my naive view, this reminds me of the hat that we were looking at from the editorial, which is what Stephen Jones made for the Tom Brown show, which is that shuttlecock. But this, I think just because this is so in front of the face, that really reminds me of that. It's interesting.
I thought that was, it's a sort of clever take of looking at something, because there is a real correlation between a shuttlecock and a bonnet.
Yeah, there is.
You know, and these were often referred to as coal scuttle bonnets because it's the same shape, you know, coal scuttle that you'd sweep up. So I think that was a fun take, because also, you know, he's the feathers as well. So and you know, the top of the shuttlecock very much sort of looks like these little crowns on these hats.
Completely.
So, you know, why has no one done it before? Well done, Steve.
Well done, Stephen.
So, no, but it's so there, you know, that sort of shape is definitely you can see the link.
And would this have been a fashionable woman, someone who was playing with androgyny? You know, you mentioned the top hat, or is this more just to do with hat style? She's not making a statement here.
No, I think that they did become popular, and you often get also for you know, different types of activity and things, sometimes for riding as well.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, this sort of a version of the top hat is worn often with a little veil. So yeah, they are sort of fashionable item, but it's very beautifully decorated with a very simple velvet ribbon, which is just placed, stitched around, and then it would have the satin ribbon that tied under the face. So the bonnet really sort of, this is kind of the last full-on bonnet that you really see in the 60s and 70s. They tend to move back on the head because hairstyles again are becoming quite elaborate.
Hair in front of the face, yeah.
Yeah, and chignons becoming quite big, and as a result, bonnets suddenly shrink down to...
Is that what we're seeing here with these very minute examples?
Yeah, there's a very tiny little example there that I'm going to just reach in for. So this little one here. So it's basically just a little straw hood, and I take it off its amount.
Absolutely tiny, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you know, it just becomes this sort of very frivolous little accessory that's nestled in a lot of hair at the very back of the head. It would still tie underneath the chin. It's got lots of elaborate bows. It's got a little velvet lining inside, and then it's got these beautiful silk flowers at the back.
It's beautiful.
Quite sweet.
And is this kind of, looking at it now to you, is this an emblem of the bonnet's fall from favour? Do you start seeing them get smaller and smaller? And
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, by the sort of 1890s, really, they've become, you know, something very different. You know, they're no longer shielding the face.
Yeah.
And you know, this is a lovely example here from 1889, and it's sort of like a little pair of bat ears.
Could be from a medium Kirchhoff collection, couldn't it?
Completely, yeah.
I love it.
So that would have sat sort of on the head like this. And you know, it's a very lovely milliner's velvet, so it's a very deep plush, which they don't make anymore. But also, you know, again, looking at the back of the hat, it's quite interesting, the sort of the decoration there. So, I mean,
and were these intended to look almost like animalistic? These little...
Well, yeah, I mean, you do get, there is a sort of fashion for bats. They become quite a fashionable emblem. You get them on, painted on fans or references to them. Yeah, so I mean, I you know, I would say that they weren't, you know, oblivious to the fact that they had two little ears sticking out.
Not as obvious as Ricardo's horns, but it's on its way, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, similar silhouette. So, I mean, you do get various incarnations of the bonnet popping up here and there, you know, throughout the early 20th century. And I think in the 40s, again, it is a particular style of hat, sort of set back a bit from the face. These small little bonnets become popular. But as a sort of item that's in every woman's wardrobe and worn on a mass scale, it's really, you know, by the end of the 19th century, it's really disappearing.
Should we go see some more of the amazing bonnets that we've got in the stores? So now we're in the store cupboards having a look at some more, and we've got some amazing examples of some of the bonnets that you were sort of discussing and some of the shapes that we were talking about. Tell me what we're having a look at here. I'm a big fan of this pancake stack.
Yeah, this is fabulous. I mean, it's quite hard to see because we have some fantastic conservation mounting in here, but you can sort of get an idea of that hat, and it would have been worn tilted back, so the face would have been sort of viewed straight in this way. And it's again from that period that we're talking about, early 19th century, this is 1820s, and you know, it's as you say, a bit like a pancake stack. It's made from a really lovely velvet, and then it has these fabulous tartan ribbons on the side. So again, a very fashionable hat, and quite a statement.
Tell me more, because when we were in here before having a sneak peek, you were telling me about this idea that sometimes the hats would even reference sort of elements of fashion, so even a crinoline referenced in a hat, which was fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can definitely see elements of dress, such as this little bonnet here. dresses that are worn at the time, you get this sort of echo of this kind of piping in the actual structure of the dress, on the hems and things. So it is interesting to note and to look at it as often as sort of full outfits, because as we were saying, they don't really stand alone. They relate a lot to the outfits. And some of the hats that we have in the collection, we also have the original outfit they were worn with. So that's really, really nice to see.
That's fascinating.
And then down below we have these little caps that would have been worn usually indoors, just to cover the head. So they would be sort of washable, but as you can see, they're very decorative. A lot of them ribbons and bows and things. And sometimes
you would see those frills sometimes as you were saying, poking up.
Yeah, some of them would be worn under bonnets, so you could have these sort of decorations around the face.
And do we see much change in those sort of through the ages, or do they tend to stay quite plain?
No, they do change with fashion too. With something like this one, you could remove the ribbon in these channels, the broderie anglaise, so you take the silk out before you washed it. This is quite labour intensive. But yeah, they do change in shape and style, so they're sort of longer on the head in the earlier period, and then when you get to the mid-century, they're sort of rounder and show more of the face. And the embellishments, again, sometimes echo the shapes of hairstyles of the time.
It's interesting. Is there any notion of being fashionable within the home? So sort of looking fashionable to your sisters or your mother, not just the people who see in the streets?
Absolutely. No, definitely. It sort of does reach all areas of sort of clothing that you would wear indoors and outdoors and caps. So yeah, no, that's true. Lots of different styles of straw plait as well. So it's all twisted straw, and then you get these flat parts here ironed out, and when it's new and it's reflecting light, it looks like gold. So it's quite incredible. And those caps that fitted very close to the head, and all the shape is quite simple, but actually the embellishment is, the straw work is quite incredible, all the work, and it's probably Swiss. You can see there's a little veil around the edge which has these strawwork stars and flowers, and it's mixed in also with crin, which is horsehair. So the sort of white elements and the veil itself are made with horsehair. It's quite something.
And some of these straw ones are fantastic.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This one here, which is made again from horsehair, or crin, and that's got these amazing little curls, sort of little tubular decorations that would have been worn like that and just open.
It's interesting because these are so complex in the design, but obviously they're much more subtle than something like the big, very fashion-forward bonnets that we were looking at before. But would these have also been worn by fashionable women?
Absolutely. I think at this period in the early part of the century, there is a real feeling for sort of nature, the natural body.
Sure.
So absolutely, I think, that's a good point. This is the cap I was talking about earlier, and you can see that it very much references hairstyles in the sort of 1840s, 50s.
So you would see hair coming down there?
Yeah, I think if you weren't wearing the cap, that's the sort of shape that your hairstyle would take, with the middle parting and these kind of heavy curls to the front. So it is quite fun to see that, and I think we do have our false hair piece.
Yes, which I'm both obsessed by and terrified by in equal measure.
So these,
it's so horrible.
Again, we're sort of popular because you could pop them on your own hair and have sort of a quite elaborate hairstyle.
Which is fantastic, because in Nick's editorial, Eamon Hughes, who did the hair, actually made a hair out of a bonnet.
Yeah, the bonnet, which is made of hair, which is really beautiful. So,
which I really thought had no historical roots, but it turns out.
I mean, it's.
And would this have been worn by an older woman who was losing her hair, or was it just very much?
No, not necessarily. It was quite a fashionable thing. So it's a sort of quick, sort of quick pop-on hairdo. Get up in the morning and just think, oh,
hair extension, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, but easily removed and put on a stand beside your bed in the evening. So.
The historical equivalent of sort of The Only Way is Essex. Right?
Yeah,
it's lovely.
And then we did speak about dresses which refer to the shapes of the clothing, and this is a bonnet from the 1860s, and you can see the actual shape of it is very like a crinoline structure.
I find this one just fascinating for that reason.
Yeah, and then it has this very, again, the bavalet, the little curtain at the back is quite dramatic, but lots and lots of lace inside. So it's sort of very feminine, as we said. But also, you know, it has been made from very delicate materials and probably hasn't stood the test of time so well.
Is that a difficulty with a lot of hats, because obviously when there's so much intricate handwork on them? Or I guess in a way they were made to be quite robust, weren't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're made to be robust, but actually, you know, the poor things, particularly with the straw ones, they need a 3D form. So a lot of the time, if they do survive, somebody's maybe stuff them in a box or in the back of a drawer. This little bonnet, it's got quite a sharp fold on the front of it, which wouldn't necessarily have been there originally. You know, but sometimes if things, so it's hard for hats. Just because unlike a piece of clothing that can be folded or hung and can sort of live at the back of a wardrobe, they need space. So they tend to, you know, to suffer quite a bit and get bashed around a bit. And I think, as you say, people expect them to be quite robust, but often they're quite fragile.
Yeah, tell me about this, because this is my favourite. So
this is interesting because this is a half mourning cap. So it's a cap that was worn during mourning, and lots of strict rules around what you wear when you lose a relative or someone within your family that dies during the 19th century. Of course, Queen Victoria, very prominent in her mourning. And when Albert dies in 1861, she spends the rest of her life in mourning wear. The idea was that deep mourning you would wear just completely black and very particular fabrics. But then as the mourning period went on, you were allowed to go into half mourning, and half mourning would mean you could have sort of touches of lace and also wear colours such as pale greys and mauves. So you can see here with this cap, it's sort of got the mauves in it. These little sort of dewdrop or glass sort of structures or beads connotated the idea of water a lot of the time, and they're popular.
And the little flowers very up close, you're right, and the dewdrop, which is beautiful.
As you were pointing out, you know, also because they sort of drop and they tremble, they do reference tears a bit too. Sadness. So there is that idea that you are still in mourning and you're reminding people of it.
Match your gloves perfectly as well.
Yes, I know. The other hat, which has a nice example of those dewdrops, is this lovely little French hat, which would have been worn forward on the head. And these are little conservation pieces here, so they're not actually part of the original hat. But you can see there is some really beautiful little glass drops which suggest dew, and that was very popular. And you know, it's quite a beautiful naturalistic setting, a little arrangement. This is made from feathers, this little flower here, but then you get poppies coming out and sort of little mini ferns, and again, like we saw earlier, the ears of corn. So
my favourite hat decoration is, as you were saying, the 70s Christmas decoration like mushroom that we're getting in this one, which is just so bizarre.
Yeah, it is interesting. Again, with sort of historic pieces, I suppose you always have to be wary that it hasn't been trimmed more recently. You know, maybe used as a fancy dress item at some point before it came into the museum. And sometimes you do find that. You think, that doesn't look quite right. But that is quite strange. But you do get very interesting sort of strange glass ornaments and things, coloured glass.
Those references to nature, you were saying, it's fascinating.
You know, these little sprigs of flowers. The sort of artistry and the finish on the silk flowers that you get in this period is quite amazing. You know, they're just so beautiful. And that, again, was another very big industry, silk flower making, which, again, is no longer really with us. But, you know, there was a huge demand for decoration, which, you know, was fueled by the millinery industry. So and has little sort of cartridge or little type pleats at the back.
And then we've got another example in there of the more minimal hat, didn't we, the Quaker.
And again, you can see that very simple little cord at the back. So,
which is such a contrast to, sorry, I keep making you get them in and out, but such a contrast to what we see underneath, where there's that real sort of focus on, you were saying it's like an oriental element, so it's much more kind of fashion forward, I guess, in a way, isn't
I mean,
it?
this one is very much looking at different sort of elements. There's little Chinese ivories on the front, but there's also cut steel decoration.
Yeah, they look so modern.
Yeah, he's sort of like the Valentino rock star.
Yeah, exactly.
It's here. So, and then the nice little egret feather with the lace over the top. So all sorts of different sources of inspiration. All kinds of everything, really,
Yeah,
on these
so
hats.
striking,
Yeah,
how diverse they are, how different.
yeah, and I think, you know, a lot of it is to do with personal taste, and what people would ask their milliners to put together for them.
Beautiful. I cannot thank you enough for taking us through all these amazing bonnets. And I feel bad for calling you a bonnet obsessive at the start because it does make you sound a little bit like a hat fetishist. But I think it's very applicable because such an amazing knowledge that you have of all these amazing hats. And I think what I love is just the stories behind them, is because you can tell all this stuff about sort of the history of the period, but mostly you just imagine the women that wore them and what they were thinking about and what they were, how they wanted to look and how they wanted to present themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it sort of brings it, you know, it makes it real in a way to have something tangible and something that you can actually hold and look at and sort of get that sense that somebody was wearing this with, you know, an eye to fashion or not. So, yeah.
All the little personal things, from the little oriental details to the mushroom to the flowers to the dewdrops, it's beautiful. So thank you so much.
Thank you.